The progressive era in America was about much more than women getting the right to vote. This is often seen as the culmination of the progressive movement, according to many historians. However, today I'm going to talk about the different movements that characterize this era, as well as the women's suffrage movement. So, in this video, I've categorized the movements into 4 categories: better working and living conditions, fixing corrupt government and businesses, conservation, and then, of course, women's suffrage. In general, this era was a reaction to industrialization and the Gilded Age and those developments. If you want to learn more about that era, I will link last week's video in the top right and in the description. So in terms of better working and living conditions, Jacob Riis, who I mentioned at the end of last week's video, helped to raise awareness for the terrible living conditions in a photo book entitled How the Other Half Lives. He photographed tenements and their conditions, which included overcrowding. Many families were crammed into rooms together, and many shared a toilet, among other sanitary things, which made for very unsanitary conditions. And as a result, disease spread in these tenements, and many people, unfortunately, did die of preventable diseases. In addition to unsafe living conditions, many of the factory owners had unsafe working conditions as well, due to the lack of child labor laws and labor laws in general. So at this time, employers could have their employees work for 12 hours nonstop. And movements in this era, helped, first of all, get rid of child labor, and second of all, make working conditions safer because workplace injuries were common in this time. One person that helped improve working conditions for workers, specifically in the meatpacking industry in this case, was Upton Sinclair, who in his book, The Jungle, exposed the harsh and unsanitary conditions in the meatpacking industry. In turn, it led to food and drug safety standards that were in the 1906 Food and Drug Act to make sure that the food that was in slaughterhouses, because that's where Upton Sinclair worked, and just in general, that there were safety requirements that food had to meet in order to be consumed by the public. A second group of progressives, or a second grouping of movements during progressive era, took on corrupt government both locally and nationally, and big business, so big companies. During this time, companies, as I discussed last week, engaged in unethical and sometimes illegal practices to gain as much wealth as possible. In the case of Standard Oil, that company had a monopoly on the oil industry in the late 19th century, and journalists known as muckrakers helped expose corruption in big business. And during the Gilded Age and the beginning of the 20th century, the national government the presidency was characterized by a bunch of scandals as well. So journalists such as Ida Tarbell exposed the corrupt practices of government and big business. In her case, she was the journalist that helped expose the corrupt practices of Standard Oil and led to the breakup of that company. But to further help with the monopolistic tendencies of some businesses, the Sherman Anti-Trust Act was passed in 1890, which outlawed monopolies like Standard Oils and many other companies run by robber barons. And it led to the breakup of companies like Standard Oil into smaller companies as well. And then city governments were reformed as well, especially to help with working conditions. As I mentioned, Jacob Riis's book helped the New York legislature pass safety standards for tenements as well. And political machines, yes, they were in existence well into the 20th century, but movements helped local government become less corrupt as well. A movement that does not get talked about at or very much during school classes or in textbooks for that matter is the conservation movement during the early 20th century, which very broadly called for federal supervision and preservation of resources for future generations as well as current uh, generations as well. Land speculators, which basically bought up a lot of land in the hope of making money off of it, were using that land not very well in terms of considering resources. And then mines, of course, were mining and using unsafe practices that harmed the environment. Teddy Roosevelt is the president that helped the conservation movement happen during the Progressive era. He owned a ranch in what is now North Dakota, and that helped inform his uh, views on conservation as well. So during Teddy Roosevelt's administration, he put an end to the wasteful use of resources and reclaimed neglected land that was uh, rounded up by land speculators, among other people. And then there were two commissions that he commissioned as well. The Inland Waterways Commission helped study the relation of rivers, soil, forests, water development, and water transportation, as those two things were picking up at this time as well. That was in 1907, and then the National Commission of 1909 helped with long-range plans for preserving natural resources. And now for the women's suffrage movement. It had been around a long time before the 20th century. It took almost a century from the beginnings of the women's suffrage movement and the abolition movement in the 1830s to gaining the right to vote in 1920. Now, this effort peaked in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in addition to wanting women to get the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement also teamed up to promote gender equality and rights for working mothers, as well as working with the temperance movement, which was a movement to ban alcohol because it made people do evil things, among other things as well. That was another successful movement that the women's suffrage movement banded with. Prohibition lasted from 1920 to 1933 because, of course, if alcohol was illegal, people would just make it in the bathtubs. That was very common. So that is a brief overview of the movements that characterized the Progressive era. As you can see, this era was about a lot more than just women gaining the right to vote. As always, if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. Feel free to comment about any topics within history you would like me to make a video about, and I will see you here next week for another video.